sexy guys do. Explore what's all in their minds. Thinking about a thing or two, about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark, and I'll be your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, and particularly joined by Joe this time. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, for starters, welcome to Seattle, because in a Mansplaining First, we are in the same room. This is our first non-bi-coastal episode of Mansplaining. We are here together to record for your listening pleasure. So, Joe, welcome.
Thank you. And this is really exciting for me because not only are we doing this podcast eye to eye for the first time, but I haven't seen you in 15 years. So it might be hard for our listeners to believe since we've been seamlessly doing this podcast for almost 100 episodes, but we haven't seen each other in years. So it's really cool to do this.
Yeah, I know. And believe me, much easier to edit than us splicing together two audio things.
Yes.
Okay, so this week's episode, there are basically two types of mansplaining episode in my mind. There's the thing that's super in the news. We got to talk about it because everyone's talking about it. And then there are things that are just sort of hanging around in the back of your head. And this is one of the latter ones, which is, for years, I've been hearing just idle speculation about how our energy and water infrastructures might be susceptible to attacks by hackers. And so psychologically, that means that whenever there's a power outage in my area, some part of me is wondering, did the hackers finally get to us? Have they shut down our infrastructure where this is going to be a national calamity? So I'm honestly curious just how big a threat this is. And my question to you was, how credible is the threat that foreign hackers will mess with our energy or water infrastructure? And I'm super interested to find out what you learned.
Yeah, well, thanks as usual for the question. And this is a good question because it has a very simple answer on the surface. But then when you probe a little deeper, the nuance comes out. So I'm going to try to do justice to both. So here's something that might surprise you, Mark. Of all the questions you've given me for our podcast in 4+ years, this one is actually the easiest to answer on the surface. Foreign hacking of our energy and water infrastructure is a credible threat because it's already happening. Russian, Chinese, and Iranian hackers are already messing with critical infrastructure systems throughout the United States, including energy and water. The threat from China is the most concerning to U.S. officials for reasons I'll get into.
Okay.
But before I say more, I want to sketch out the parameters of my answer. Your question was about hackers, so I'm not going to say anything about physical attacks to our infrastructure, which have also risen dramatically in recent years, with white supremacists in particular targeting the electrical grid. Nor am I going to talk about the other ways infrastructure can be damaged or destroyed, from the classic squirrel on the power line to truly horrific scenarios like an electromagnetic pulse from a solar flare, or an enemy missile knocking out power for months or even years. If you want to read about dystopian nonfiction, that's the area, if you're into that kind of stuff.
Let me just interject that the origin of the term computer bug is actual bugs that would get into like the early IBM mainframes and chew on the wires.
Oh, interesting.
And so that's where that term comes from.
Yeah. So there's a whole host of stuff like that we're not going to cover here. Instead, I'm going to give you a few examples of cyber attacks made in recent years and what we're doing to defend against them. It's by no means a comprehensive list of attacks or even necessarily the most important ones. Nor is it a laundry list of all the techniques our enemies used. It's just a sampling. I think the details of each attack are less important than the extent to which we're being messed with.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I want you to think about as we go through this, the extent to which we're being messed with. And I'm going to say more about that at the end. Okay, first example. You probably remember this one. In May 2021, the Colonial Pipeline, one of the largest pipelines in the U.S., built way back in 1962 to move oil from refineries in the Gulf of Mexico to markets on the East Coast, was victimized by a ransomware attack that infected its digital finance systems and forced it to shut down for several days, whereupon President Biden declared a state of emergency and issued an executive order directing various U.S. government agencies to take proactive steps to bolster cybersecurity. You remember that? I basically remember reading about that.
Yeah, I heard about it.
Yeah. The attack was made by a cyber criminal group later identified as DarkSide, which is believed to be based in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
To get the decryption key for its IT staff to regain control of its systems, the owners of the pipeline ended up paying ransom to DarkSide in Bitcoin, which incidentally is about the only thing cryptocurrency is good for.
Yes.
The shutdown caused a jet fuel shortage that affected airlines up and down the East Coast and also led to gas shortages and higher gas prices in some eastern states. More importantly, and to the point I just made about the extent to which we're being messed with, it had a huge psychological impact on consumers.
Mm-hmm.
The Federal Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, that's an acronym you're going to hear a lot in this episode, which coordinates our cyber defense activities, chronicled the, quote, snaking lines of cars at gas stations across the eastern seaboard, end quote, as Americans' fear of being unable to get to work or take their kids to school led to panic buying at the pumps, which in turn caused a brief spike in the price of gas. As many of us recall from the incident with Hillary Clinton's email servers during her campaign for president in 2016, Russia has been at this for a while.
Yeah.
Donald Trump may have been fine and dandy with that. But since taking office in 2021, the Biden administration has focused on anti-hacking efforts, and not just because they're worried about malign actors disrupting the presidential election this fall, but also to counter the ransomware attacks on corporate America that were widespread last year. In a report released earlier this month, CISA announced that a Russian intelligence unit with the acronym GRU was responsible for, quote, computer network operations against global targets for the purposes of espionage, sabotage, and reputational harm since at least 2020, end quote. This past March, two senior Biden administration officials, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and EPA Administrator Michael Regan, issued a public letter about recent, quote, disabling cyber attacks striking water and wastewater systems throughout the United States, end quote. They cited a case where a group of hackers known as the Cyber Avengers, and that's with a 3 in the E for the first E in Avengers, so it looks a little weird, but it's Cyber Avengers, affiliated with Iran's Revolutionary Guard. They took control of a municipal water authority booster station located outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Booster stations typically regulate and monitor water pressure, and in this attack, the targeted controller was replaced by a message stating in all caps, "You have been hacked." The message also said, "Down with Israel," and cited the facility's use of software owned by the Israeli company Unitronics as justification for why it was a quote-unquote legal target of the operation.
Let me just point out the irony of hackers citing the legality of their procedures.
Yes. Well, trying to justify their activity. According to their page on X, and yes, Mark. Foreign hackers are apparently permitted by Elon Musk to post about their exploits on X. What a wonderful world we live in. Cyber Avengers have taken responsibility for other attacks worldwide, including the targeting of 10 water treatment stations in Israel. You might be wondering, as I did, why hackers would target a municipal water authority serving 2 small towns in western Pennsylvania, rather than, say, New York City's water supply.
I have a guess. Should I guess what the reason is?
Yeah, go ahead.
That they had a specific vulnerability in mind, like a piece of software issued by Microsoft or someone else that allowed them to get in, and they scanned everything, and it just happened to be the one outside Pittsburgh that had that vulnerability.
Yes, in terms of technique to actual reason, yes. But there's another reason that I'm going to get into, but that is definitely part of it. So I think the answer to my own rhetorical question is that hackers are constantly probing for vulnerabilities in our infrastructure, rather than attempting much more provocatively to shut down entire systems. This is another example of what I mean by thinking about the extent to which we're being messed with, right? They're not taking down anything. They're probing.
Right, constantly.
Yeah. Often it's the smaller, less resourced facilities that are most vulnerable. And that's the point you just made. Yeah. The Water Information Sharing and Analysis Center, an industry group, warned its members shortly after the Pennsylvania attack that no facilities are immune. Quote, often we aren't targets for who or where we are, but for what we have and how accessible, meaning vulnerable or exploitable, it is, regardless of the size of our organization or how many people we service, end quote.
Yeah.
So in their public letter, Sullivan and Regan also cited a Chinese hacking group that calls itself Volt Typhoon, which according to them had, quote, compromised information technology of multiple critical infrastructure systems, including drinking water, in the United States and its territories, end quote. The letter went on to say that such activities, quote, have the potential to disrupt the critical lifeline of clean and safe drinking water, as well as impose significant costs on affected communities, end quote. It called on governors to prepare for future incidents by ensuring that state and municipal water systems reassess their current cybersecurity practices. The FBI and Department of Justice disrupted Volt Typhoon's operation in May 2023 by disabling malicious Chinese software that had hijacked a botnet. I didn't know what a botnet is. You might know, so I'm going to tell everybody. It's a network of hundreds of remotely controlled small routers, modems, and VPN hardware. Most of it older generation and thus not updated with the latest security patches. So that's why it's such a ripe target.
Yeah.
The botnet wasn't government controlled. This is an important point. The routers and modems were owned by local companies and private citizens. I found this explanation of the hack to be illuminating. It was made by a security official. Quote, how it works is the Chinese are taking control of a camera or a modem that is positioned geographically right next to a port or ISP, and then using that destination to route their intrusions into the real target. To the IT team at the downstream target, it looks just like a normal native user that's sitting nearby, end quote. In other words, the purpose of the attack was to seed the ground for future mayhem by positioning malware that could be used for potential cyber attacks on the target facility.
Yeah.
Really ingenious strategy.
Right. Something I've noticed, which is concerning a little bit, is the apparent sophistication of attacks that come from countries like Iran or North Korea, where you would not think high-tech capabilities, but they've been at it for so long that they develop skills that are world-class and are, not in the interest of the United States or its citizens.
Yes. I'm not going to mention the North Koreans today, but they are certainly active as well. It's basically the good old axis of evil that we're up against here. So despite our successful disruption of the Volt typhoon attack, in congressional testimony several months later, FBI Director Christopher Wray did not mince words when he said, quote, China's multi-pronged assault on our national and economic security make it the defining threat of our generation. End quote. He added that there's been far too little public focus on Chinese targeting of critical infrastructure, including water treatment plants, the electrical grid, oil and natural gas pipelines, and transportation systems. He said Chinese hackers were poised to wreak havoc by degrading and destroying critical infrastructure at a time of their choosing. That's another important phrase I want you to remember as we go forward, at a time of their choosing. Mm-hmm. CISA's current director, Jen Easterly, echoed Ray's concerns and added, quote, a major crisis halfway across the planet could well endanger the lives of Americans here at home through the disruption of our pipelines, the severing of our telecommunications, the pollution of our water facilities, the crippling of our transportation modes. End quote. China has more recently begun outsourcing some of its hacking activities to private Chinese contractors, which is why U.S. officials now believe the workforce behind Chinese hacking dwarfs the American workforce attempting to prevent or disrupt such attacks.
Yeah. The thing that's always in China's back pocket is just the incredible manpower that they
People power, yeah.
Right, yeah.
Right. According to intelligence officials, all of China's recent intrusions were meant to send a message that it could at any point disrupt our electrical or water supply or our communications networks. Tellingly, some of China's operations took place near American military bases that would be involved in our rapid response to an attack on Taiwan. Such bases rely on civilian infrastructure, and that's where the vulnerabilities are.
Right.
In conjunction with the U.S. government's response, Microsoft announced in the spring of 2023 that it had separately uncovered Chinese attempts to disrupt our critical infrastructure, and it published a summary of the techniques used by Volt Typhoon to infiltrate our systems and how to defend against them. I reviewed the advisories issued by Microsoft and CISA, and I couldn't make heads or tails of all the code and techno jargon. But I'll post them to our Facebook page for any IT types who might be listening. My takeaway is that the defense of our vital assets against hostile foreign hackers is most definitely a public-private partnership. Yeah. Indeed, the Biden White House has met with industry leaders in cloud computing and telecom to solicit their help in tracking the hackers' activity. China has been America's primary geopolitical rival for a while now, and so it should come as no surprise that we've been monitoring it as a cybersecurity threat since the early years of the 21st century. According to The Atlantic magazine, by the end of the 2000s, quote, the Chinese army had begun extensively training its soldiers in hacking techniques, end quote. Even though it knew the Chinese government was complicit in at least 141 successful intrusions in at least 20 industrial sectors, including water facilities and oil and gas pipelines, the Obama administration tried to press the issue through diplomacy, not wanting to alienate a rival with whom we were trying to strengthen relations. But eventually, the scope and scale of Chinese attacks forced Obama's hand. In a 2013 speech, Obama's national security advisor, Thomas Donilon, who incidentally was just named New York City's police commissioner, like last week, publicly stated for the first time that Chinese cyber aggression had, quote, moved to the forefront of our agenda, end quote. He added that American corporations were increasingly concerned about, quote, sophisticated, targeted theft of confidential business information and proprietary technologies on an unprecedented scale, end quote.
Yeah, and that seems like the unique thing about this. It's a form of aggression that gives you plausible deniability. Yeah. That you can be taking actively hostile acts against another country at the
Yes.
same time that you're just pursuing standard diplomatic, conversations through other
Yes.
channels. So like shaking hands with your right hand and punching with your left hand simultaneously.
Yes.
Because you can always say, oh, yeah, you think it's ours. How do you know it's ours? Maybe it's some other guy's.
Yes.
Like that seems like a specifically modern aspect to diplomacy, that you can be both hostile and friendly at the same time.
Yeah. I wonder how modern that is, though, because I think that we're just, as non-diplomats, we're unused to the push and pull of something like that. You know, like I'm thinking of the story of how our diplomats were actually speaking to Japanese diplomats as they had already launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. You know, there was still diplomacy going on.
Right.
So I think a seasoned veteran of that world would probably say that this has been the way it's been forever.
Yeah.
You know?
And it occurs to me that a diplomat in a room having a conversation may have no particular knowledge of or insight into what some other branch of government has decided to do under their own mandate.
Yes.
So you could be having a good faith conversation at the same time that your country is launching a cyber attack that completely undermines the point you're making.
Yes.
And you would wish that that's not the case, but as a diplomat, you might not have any control over that.
Yes. And there's also the reciprocality of this, which I'm going to get to shortly.
Mm-hmm.
So, of all our critical infrastructure, water utilities have been targeted the most. Adam Isles, head of cybersecurity for the Chertoff Group, told CNBC that the water sector is among the least mature from a security perspective. That's scary, right?
Mm-hmm.
The EPA issued an enforcement alert this past May warning that, quote, threats to and attacks on the nation's water system have increased in frequency and severity to a point where additional action is critical, end quote. I find it interesting that the documented weaknesses in our water system security are basically the same ones you and I have in securing our own home and office computers.
Yeah.
EPA inspectors reported that more than 70% of the water systems they inspected have critical cybersecurity vulnerabilities like easily detectable logins.
Right.
Default or reused passwords.
That's just going to say that the password is password or 123.
Yes. And the passport that hasn't been updated in forever, too. That's another thing. And former employees who still have access to the system.
Sure.
Right? These are the things we deal with in our daily lives. It's funny to think that water infrastructure is compromised by the exact same thing.
Yeah, but it makes sense on reflection because who's working in water infrastructure? It's generally speaking hard hat kind of guys.
Yeah.
And so they're not bringing a real tech insight and like a digital focus to those things.
Right.
They're a lunch pail on hard hat and thermos with coffee in it sort of person.
Yes.
And so they leave the password as the default. They might not even know how to change the default password of the system.
If they're like me, they don't know how. Yeah. Now I want to make a critical distinction lest we think that things are too bad off right now. So at present, experts believe that foreign hackers don't yet have a way into the operating systems running critical facilities, since most recent attacks are to non-operating systems, like the accounting and billing systems affected by the Colonial Pipeline hack. If hackers were to take control of a water facility's operating technology, they could do scary things like disrupt the flow or availability of water, or even worse, alter the chemical levels in the water, which might result in a lethal level of lye or untreated wastewater contaminating a community's drinking water.
Yeah.
An EPA spokesman said that, quote, all drinking water and wastewater systems are at risk, large and small, urban and rural, end quote.
Wow.
But water is far from our only vulnerability. The U.S. energy grid is an aging relic that most experts believe is extremely vulnerable to cyber attacks. It's divided into three major regions. The Western Interconnection, which covers the Pacific Ocean to the Rocky Mountain states. The Eastern Interconnection, which covers states east of the Rockies. And the Texas Interconnected System, which covers, take a guess, Mark.
I'm stumped. What's the answer?
Texas.
Oh, yeah.
Together, they account for nearly 160,000 miles of high-voltage power lines fanning out from over 7,300 power plants, with millions of distribution transformers and low-voltage power lines. All that infrastructure is still, for the most part, dependent on what's politely known as legacy technologies. 70% of transmission lines are at least 30 years old and approaching the end of their life cycles, while 60% of circuit breakers exceed 35 years in service, which is nearly double their useful lives of 20 years. That means they're vulnerable to cascading failures, where the failure of one aging component leads to another and then another. This sometimes happens during spells of bad weather. It's the digital equivalent of a bridge collapse. This happened in Texas. Remember when it got really cold?
Yeah.
Unusually cold?
Right.
The entire system fell apart.
Right.
With minds like steel traps, often joy here to discern the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. And it's a calling and they do it for you. Explain me, baby. Explain. It's appalling that you don't do it too.
Though the federal government has prioritized the rebuilding of energy infrastructure as part of a national transition to cleaner, more resilient electricity, the funding for that initiative must come from a polarized Congress in which one party, guess which one, doesn't want clean energy. Until Congress acts and those projects take root, we're stuck in this limbo of vulnerability. The Colonial Pipeline attack I mentioned earlier exposed the glaring lack of a framework for both preparing for and responding nimbly to future cyber attacks. Because so much of the operating technology is internet accessible, sophisticated hackers can gain remote access into adjoining business networks using techniques as low-tech as spear phishing emails. Then burrow their way into the targeted power plant like Volt Typhoon tried to do, where they can do great damage to our power grid if they so desire. And again, keep that if they so desire in mind.
Right.
Because I'm going to come back to that shortly. As we wait for the glacial Congress to move, here's a little bit of good news. The EPA believes most cyber attacks are preventable if our infrastructure sectors adopt what they call basic cyber resiliency practices. CISA's interdisciplinary report from U.S. cyber defense agencies urged all American organizations, public and private, to take defensive measures against hacking attempts, including basic things we're all familiar with, like multi-factor authentication, and regularly installing security patches on aging software. The operators of energy infrastructure are being urged to counter cyber threats via security by design. That's something I had not heard of before. That involves building agile systems that can recognize, monitor, and respond to threats as they emerge. One promising effort is the public-private Electric Grid Cybersecurity Alliance, which brings together power industry CEOs, CTOs, and operations executives with government regulators and elected officials to collaborate on cybersecurity for the entire industry. Another public-private partnership. Needless to say, Russia, Iran, and China routinely deny making cyber attacks on our infrastructure. China called the accusations about Volt Typhoon a disinformation campaign, which itself is disinformation. China also accused the U.S. of eavesdropping more than other countries, naming America as, quote, the initiator and master of cyber attacks. So this is the reciprocality
Yeah.
issue I want to bring up, because this is also crucial. It's true that America is an initiator and master of cyber attacks, but there's a caveat. Christopher Krebs, a former CISA director, said on CNBC that China's recent hacking attempts have the same psychological valence as the Colonial Pipeline attack in 2021. They're, quote, not just about disruption and destruction, but for also just broader societal panic and chaos in the event of an escalation of hostilities, end quote. Asked about whether we could turn the tables on our enemies and give them a taste of what they've been doing to us, Krebs assured viewers that our offensive capabilities are very capable, and that's no doubt true.
Mm-hmm.
By way of illustration, whenever an Israeli cyber attack takes out an Iranian nuclear reactor, you can bet the U.S. has its fingerprints all over that operation.
Yeah, sure.
Christopher Krebs also told the CNBC interviewer that we don't play the game the same way that our adversaries do. And I'm quoting Krebs here. We adhere to a set of norms where you don't go after civilian critical infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
End quote. I think this is crucial. Even as American diplomats were accusing the Chinese of rampant hacking during the Obama administration, they and their Chinese counterparts both knew that Americans were playing the same game at the same scale. But the targets were different.
Yeah.
America's hackers were not trying to steal money or IP or manufacturing secrets to boost its economy like the Chinese were. They were limited to national security operations. As The Atlantic put it, quote, espionage for national security was an ancient acceptable practice, but if the Chinese wanted to join the international economy, they had to respect the rights of property, end quote. Said the former head of the U.S. Army Cyber Command, General Paul Nakasone, quote, responsible cyber actors do not target civilian infrastructure. There's no reason for them to be in our water. There's no reason for them to be in our power, end quote.
Yeah.
A pessimist might listen to all I've said and conclude that this is what World War III might look like. And I think that's what I said to you when you first gave me the question at the end of the last episode. Not with mushroom clouds over Washington or Moscow or Beijing, but with a geopolitical incident that triggers escalating cyber warfare. For example, if the Chinese finally decide to seize Taiwan and the U.S. stands behind its vow to support Taiwan, China might use lessons learned from Volt Typhoon's low-level infiltrations into U.S. networks, plus some current infiltrations we don't even know about, to take out some of our critical infrastructure instead of just meddling with it, which is what they've been doing up until now. Disrupting facilities in Southeast Asia that serve or support U.S. military operations there would undermine our readiness to support Taiwan in repelling a Chinese invasion. The U.S. would be forced to respond in kind. And then you've got a different and far more dangerous cascading failure.
Right.
But an optimist, or perhaps better put, a realist, might listen to my presentation and think that everyone in the world has a vested interest, not to mention a moral imperative, to make sure World War III never starts. As The Atlantic put it, the purpose of Chinese and American cyber parrying is, quote, to prepare for battle, to exploit weaknesses and exert leverage, end quote. But what if the battle never happens? What if saner heads prevail and we avoid a catastrophic war with China because both parties know full well what will happen if they cross that Rubicon?
Mm-hmm.
This is why I think we'll probably never see a mass casualty cyber attack on our critical infrastructure. I heard one CNBC interviewer refer to this situation cheekily as, quote, mutually assured computer disruption, end quote. But I think that's a real phenomenon, as real as the mutually assured destruction that kept us from thermonuclear war with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The U.S. government doesn't talk about these things for obvious reasons, but it's reasonable to infer that with our country's unmatched technical sophistication and huge military-industrial complex, we can inflict at least as much cyber pain on our rivals as they can to us.
Right.
So, to return to your question and the point I made at the top, the threat that foreign hackers will mess with us in this way is credible. But in my opinion, it's not existential, because they dare not mess with us in a way that will cause their own destruction. Do you agree or disagree?
I think I'm of two minds on that. One point that you touched on was that this just is going on constantly. Like they're constantly probing for weaknesses.
Yeah, both sides.
Yeah, and it occurred to me as you're going through it that that's kind of necessary because, of course, systems are constantly being upgraded. Passwords are being changed.
Right.
Security patches are being applied to these things. So the only way to have like that thing in your back pocket, if you want it there, is to constantly be probing because you need to keep updating your map, essentially, of what the vulnerabilities are.
Right.
So that seems reasonable to me. And I do take some comfort in the fact that the operations that have surfaced are limited, because if I were Vladimir Putin and I had the ability to take out energy or water at a local level within the US, I would certainly by now have used that in order to swing certain key states politically in one direction or the other. By creating social unrest or by discrediting someone, like I would have used that by now. And so the fact that they haven't done that makes me think that they don't have that fully targeted capability.
Yeah, I agree, but I would also say, or they're afraid if they have it. Right. Maybe save this for when the fate of Russia is hanging in the balance, not just to influence a presidential election, you know?
Yeah. And then on the flip side, where I'm less optimistic, we had a local version of this, not within water or power, but there was in Seattle. There was a cyber attack against our libraries, our public library. It was one of those attacks to like give us all this Bitcoin for us to give you back access to your systems.
Right.
And the library didn't pay up. First off, they didn't have the money, and second off, you pay the ransom, they're just going to ask for more money. So that's no solution to the problem. And they were offline for months where you couldn't check out books. You couldn't return books. Like they were offline for that long. And critical infrastructure, you assume that resources would have been brought to bear, things would have come back up, but it does sort of underscore how long it can take to recover from this sort of attack.
Yes.
And so imagine if that had been energy, if that had been water, where there's no drinking water, maybe not for months, like it wouldn't have been that long, but maybe no drinking water at all for 2 weeks. People would have died. It would have been absolute devastation.
Yes.
So it does.
And the psychological panic on top of the physical toll.
So it does sort of establish the stakes. And the two things that concern me are first that infrastructure in general is something that we never seem to invest in. Like we've been hearing for how long that our bridges are about to collapse.
Yes.
Nothing's been done about that. Roads are a problem. Nothing is done about that. And it's almost as if it's a systemic problem within democracy that there's a short-term thinking aspect to that because you're always thinking about your next election, that you don't invest in the need that might not be felt for 30 years because that's someone else's problem.
Yes.
And then second, that this is a technology thing that requires, top-down government involvement. If there's a group of people who have shown themselves to be poor at understanding tech issues and establishing, guidelines for that, it's senior government officials. It's not their generation. They don't deal with it on the regular. They don't really get it. They're not very effective at that. Yeah. So I'm concerned that we never will really invest in this thing because politically there's no gain to the people who are making the decisions. And then B, I'm afraid that since it's octogenarians making the decisions will be inherently flawed. And will be, even if we do make a move, it will not be the move that we need to make.
Yeah. Those are good points. Let me try to react to them. One thing on the lack of will for infrastructure, we did pass the Inflation Reduction Act a couple years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think the American public really understands what a game changer that is. And it's not their fault in a way. It's reminded of Obamacare, where it passed, right? And then nothing happened for like 5 years.
Yeah.
So the Democrats took a drubbing at the polls because none of the perks of Obamacare went into operation until like 2014. It was passed in 2009. Similarly, with the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a really deep, profound investment in infrastructure in that bill. But these projects are only now gearing up and being unveiled. You know, it's like in the second term, Biden's second term, which hopefully will be Harris's first term, is when we're going to really see a lot of these things happen. Bridges being rebuilt and fiber optic networks and all. So so I have a little more hope than you do that infrastructure might be prioritized in the future. Once people see what a fiber optic network in rural America looks like, they're going to want them some of that, you know, and not to mention all the jobs that are going to be coming to mostly red areas of America where a lot of these things are going to be built.
Yeah.
So there's one thing. And then as to your fears, I agree with all your fears, which are a lot of it was about incompetence. The one thing I did, which is a fear of mine that I didn't mention in this podcast, is the fear of a non-state actor getting this technology, getting this know-how. Because right now we've got, and this is going to sound weird coming out of my mouth, but thank God it's the Iranian government and the Chinese government and the Russian government we're dealing with, right? And not Al-Qaeda or the Taliban doing this to us, because they might not heed the mutually assured computer disruption mantra that a state actor would. Yeah. So the greatest fear would be, Al-Qaeda getting the know-how to disrupt our water infrastructure, because they might just do it as a September 11th type of thing, wholly divorced from geopolitical situation. Yeah. And that's something to worry about. But again, I'm optimistic on this because I feel like every time the nuclear enrichment process gets delayed by 10 years, that's the good guys holding back the tide against the bad actors, Mm-hmm. And I feel like we have enough intelligence capability and offensive capability to preemptively disrupt an attack from an Al-Qaeda on a water system. Right. Now, hopefully I'm not proved wrong, but after my research, that's where I think the lay of the land is. Are you persuaded by that, or?
Yeah, personally, I'm not too afraid of Al-Qaeda being the one, because any religious group that, like, its self-identity is tied to the way things were 1,500 to 2,000 years ago, they're probably not going to be bleeding edge technologists.
Yeah, right.
So
they want us to go back to the 14th century, not...
Right.
Yeah, right.
I think I would be more concerned with someone like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber-esque, someone very sophisticated who then develops anti-technology ideas.
Lone wolf.
Right.
Who's a genius. Right.
Unleashing something, hopefully, in the expectation that it will lead to like this mutually assured destruction of systems that he wants destroyed. Yeah. Like there are people in this world who think that we need to go back to an agrarian society. They seem to not be either cognizant of or concerned about the fact that so many people would starve to death within that scenario because you can't make enough food for our current population. And within that mindset, destruction of the power grid, that's a two big thumbs up from their perspective.
Yeah, right.
And if they could do that in two countries at once, then twice as good. So that would be more my concern in terms of the terroristic threat.
Yeah, I have to admit I had not considered that, and the reason why, which I hope is a hopeful sign, is that in the reading I did, 16 sources here for this episode, I did not come across any talk about that. So that might not be the highest threat level right now, but it's certainly possible in the future. I acknowledge that.
Right.
So maybe now we shouldn't walk away from this happy, right? But I'm not as pessimistic coming out of the research as I was going in. So that's what I want to communicate to you and our audience.
Okay, yeah, and I think that's mostly true of me too. I'm still not at the point where the next time there's a blackout, I'm not going to think, did the hackers do this? Because maybe they did, and maybe it's state sponsored, or maybe it's just some high school kid trying to impress his friends. But yeah, you made some good points here. I think my parting thought is just so much of our world is entering digital spaces, right? Like warfare is now becoming partly something that you do at a computer terminal by way of, binary ones and zeros. So some aspect of warfare has transitioned from killing people and destroying buildings to infecting systems and launching cyber attacks. And in a way, that's a net positive. If someone crashes a system that has bad effects, but maybe fewer people die, maybe there's less pain as a result of that. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking of what I said at the beginning about the extent to which we're being messed with. Thus far, I think it's fair to say they've not taken out the kind of operating technology that would really disable our grid and lead to starvation or water poisoning and all.
Right.
And it's got to be a combination of they don't yet have the know-how to do it, and or they don't want to do it even if they know.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm going to hang my hat on that's going to keep us going, much the way people had this conversation 60 years ago during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
We were pulled back from the brink by grown-ups on both sides who just decided we have this technology, but we're not going to use it.
Yeah, there are a lot of parallels to nuclear proliferation on this.
Yeah.
And that countries might be building the capability just so that the other side knows that you have the capability.
Yeah.
And not necessarily with intent to use. And, with the same vulnerabilities there, just like with nuclear weapons, it just takes one person crazy enough to push the button.
Right.
Same deal here.
Yeah.
But less radiation.
Yeah. That's a grim laugh. All right. Really, really great. Looking you in the eye while we do this.
I know.
It's pretty cool.
Very different experience, by the way.
It is a different experience, but enjoyable experience.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I have a question for you next time.
Lay it on me.
All right. I get to look you in the eye as I hit you with this question. Ever since the Supreme Court struck down race-conscious affirmative action programs in higher education last year, claiming that they violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment by discriminating against white and Asian students, some people have been talking about another discriminatory tactic used by colleges and universities. I'm referring to legacy admissions,
yes.
which arguably discriminated against students of color by giving an unfair boost to the mostly white children of alumni.
Yes.
How is it fair, these people argue, that schools are forced to ignore the race of their applicants, but they're allowed to favor the children of wealthy alumni and donors? Since neither of us is a constitutional lawyer, Mark, I'm not going to ask you whether legacy admissions run afoul of the 14th Amendment, so you can rest easy on that. But I am going to ask you these two questions. How prevalent are legacy admissions policies in American colleges and universities? And are there any good reasons for retaining them?
Okay. I'll get on that. I'll be working on that for the next few weeks. In the meantime, that's it for this episode. If you would like to follow up on any of Joe's sources, he'll be posting them to Facebook, which is where we have a post for every single one of our episodes. You can go through, you can follow up on sources, you can leave comments or questions. We very much appreciate and answer every question that is posted there.
And my sources for this episode are the same people who are behind they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. So that should give you a feeling of confidence.
Yeah, grounded in science here.
Yes.
If you'd like to thank us for putting this podcast out free of charge to you, the home listener, you can give us some thanks on your podcast player of choice. Maybe that's Apple iTunes, maybe that's Spotify, maybe it's Google, Amazon, wherever you find this podcast. You can find Mansplaining listed. If you look us up, you can leave us a rating and a review. 5 stars helps other people discover the podcast, and it makes us eternally grateful to you. But I'm going to leave it at that because I need to get busy researching the next one. Have a good few weeks. Thank you for joining us. This has been Mark, and that was Joe, and we'll see you next time.
Talk to you next time.
The lights flicker in the city, power's going down. Someone's out there dancing, turning switches all around. From across the ocean, sneaky fingers tap the keys. Our grids are under fire, but we're not dropping to our knees. Water pipes are shaking, lights are on the brink, but we'll keep on grooving, we're much too smart to sink. Their codes can try to crash us, but we'll never go slow. Gonna outsmart the hackers and keep the rhythm in our flow. Hey, hey, cyber boogie, we're dancing through the night. Keep the power flowing while we fight that digital fight. They can try to take us down, but we're always on the go. Don't mess with our energy, we're in control of the show. Wires hum with danger, but we've got the beat in line. Throw those firewalls up and make the system shine. They'll never break the music, they'll never cut the heat. We're spinning all the records, moving hackers to defeat. Water pipes are shaking, lights are on the brink, but we'll keep on grooving, we're much too smart to sink. Their codes can try to crash us, but we'll never go slow. Gonna outsmart the hackers and keep the rhythm in our flow. Hey, hey, cyber boogie, we're dancing through the night. Keep the power flowing while we fight that digital fight. They can try to take us down, but we're always on the go. Don't mess with our energy, we're in control of the show. Hackers wanna play, but we're ready for the game. They can't stop our water, they can dim our flame. We got the moves and we've got the style, we'll keep on boogieing mile after mile. Hey, hey, cyber boogie, we're dancing through the night. Keep the power flowing while we fight that digital fight. They can try to take us down, but we're always on the go. Don't mess with our energy, we're in control of the show. Shake it, don't lose the beat. We'll keep the city running, we'll feel the heat. Cyber boogie, we've got the groove. No hacker's gonna stop our disco move.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.
Is the